I've sat in a lot of chairs over the years, and I've looked into the eyes of thousands of people who were convinced they were the hero of their own story, even when the world around them was burning to the ground. But there is a specific kind of silence that happens in my studio right before the cameras start rolling, a heavy, thick kind of tension that tells me someone isn't just hurting, they are hiding. They're hiding behind a version of the truth they've polished so many times that they actually believe it's the only one that exists. That was the case with Sarah. When she walked onto my stage, she didn't look like a woman who had lost her way. She looked like a woman who had come to collect a debt. She carried herself with a rigid, calculated grace. Her spine as straight as a poker, and she was clutching a thick blue 3-ring binder like it was a shield. To her, that binder was a legal brief against her own children. To me, it was a roadmap of a family's disintegration. She sat down, smoothed her skirt, and looked at me with an expression that said, "Finally, someone sensible is going to tell me I'm right." That's a dangerous place to be, and I knew right then that we weren't just dealing with a family feud, we were dealing with a catastrophic breakdown of reality. Sarah was a 58-year-old retired school teacher, a woman who prided herself on order, discipline, and what she called high standards. She had 2 adult children, Emily and David, both of whom had completely cut her out of their lives for the better part of 3 years. No phone calls, no holiday visits, no pictures of the grandkids, just a cold, hard wall of silence. In Sarah's mind, she was the victim of a coordinated campaign of parental alienation orchestrated by her son-in-law and daughter-in-law. She used those words, parental alienation, like she was reading them out of a textbook, but she didn't understand the weight of them. She told me with total conviction that she had been a perfect, devoted mother who had sacrificed everything only to be cast aside by children who had been brainwashed by outsiders. I've seen this pattern 100 times. It's the martyr complex mixed with a high control personality. When people can't control their environment, they start trying to control the narrative. They start building a case. And Sarah had built a monumental case. She spent the first 20 minutes of our pre-interview briefing showing me emails, text, and handwritten notes she'd kept for a decade. She had highlights, she had tabs, and she had a timeline of every slight she had ever endured. But as I listened to her, I wasn't looking at the binder. I was looking at the way she narrowed her eyes when she spoke about her daughter Emily. There was no grief there. There was no "I miss my baby" in her tone. There was only a cold, burning resentment that her property, her children, had dared to develop a will of their own. She was more upset about the defiance than she was about the distance. That's a red flag you can see from a mile away. To understand how Sarah ended up sitting across from me, you have to go back to the way she viewed the role of a parent. In her mind, being a mother wasn't a relationship, it was a management position. She grew up in a very rigid household where love was conditional. It was earned through performance, grades, and obedience. She took that blueprint and applied it to her own kids, thinking she was doing them a favor by preparing them for the real world. But the real world is built on connection, and she was building a fortress. When Emily was young, Sarah picked her clothes, her friends, and her hobbies. If Emily deviated, the cold shoulder came out. Sarah used emotional withdrawal as a weapon before Emily even hit puberty. By the time Emily went to college, she was already looking for the exit. But Sarah had her hooks in deep. She used guilt like a surgical instrument. She'd call Emily crying, saying her heart was failing or that she couldn't pay the mortgage, forcing Emily to rush home and rescue her. It was a classic case of enmeshment where the parent consumes the child's identity to feed their own need for significance. The escalation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing crawl toward a breaking point. The real trouble started when Emily got married to a man named Mark. Mark was the first person in Emily's life who looked at the way Sarah treated her and said, "That's not normal." He didn't play the game. When Sarah would call at 2 a.m. with a manufactured crisis, Mark would tell Emily to turn off her phone. When Sarah would show up unannounced at their apartment with cleaning supplies because she didn't think Emily was keeping a proper home, Mark would stand at the door and refuse to let her in. In Sarah's eyes, Mark wasn't a protective husband. He was an interloper. He was a kidnapper who had stolen her daughter's mind. She started a smear campaign, telling everyone in their small town that Mark was abusive and that Emily was a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. She actually tried to file for a wellness check on them multiple times, using the police as a way to harass them into submission. It got uglier. Sarah's son, David, tried to stay neutral for a while, but eventually the pressure became too much. He saw what was happening to Emily and realized it was only a matter of time before his own wife and children were in the crosshair. When David finally set a boundary, telling his mother she couldn't speak disrespectfully about his sister in his house, Sarah went nuclear. She didn't just argue, she attacked. She told David he was a disappointment and that he was spitting on his father's grave by taking Emily's side. That was the last straw. David and Emily sat down together and made a pact. They sent a joint letter to Sarah telling her that until she sought professional help and took accountability for her behavior, they would have no contact with her. They changed their numbers, they blocked her on social media, and they moved on with their lives. But Sarah didn't move on. She spent the next 3 years obsessing. She became a digital stalker, creating fake profiles to see pictures of her grandkids. She sent gifts to their homes that were actually thinly veiled insults, books on how to be a better daughter, or clothes for the kids that were 2 sizes too small, just so she could complain that she didn't know their sizes because she was being shut out. She convinced herself that the only way to save her family was to bring them onto a national stage. She contacted my producers with a story about a grieving mother whose children had been stolen by a cult-like influence. She thought the lights, the audience, and the Dr. Phil authority would finally force her children to see that she was the victim. She didn't realize that I don't take sides, I take the truth. And the truth doesn't care about your binder. When I first walked into the dressing room to meet her before the show, the air changed. She was sitting there with a publicist-ready smile, her binder open on her lap. She started talking before I could even say hello, launching into a rehearsed speech about family values and the sanctity of the mother-child bond. I just stood there and let her talk. I let her spin the web. I've learned that if you let people talk long enough, they will eventually tell you exactly what's wrong with them without even knowing it. She kept using the word I. I did this. I felt that. I am the one suffering. Not once did she ask how Emily was doing. Not once did she express concern for David's well-being. It was all about her loss, her pain, her reputation. I looked at her and I thought, you aren't here for a reunion. You're here for a win. And in a family, if one person wins, the relationship loses. The stage was set. We had Emily on a satellite feed from a remote location. She refused to be in the same room as her mother, and I didn't blame her. David had declined to participate entirely, but he'd sent a statement that was so heartbreakingly clear, it made the hair on my arm stand up. Sarah didn't know about the statement yet. She thought she was going to have a moment with Emily where I would facilitate an apology to her. She was so convinced of her own righteousness that she couldn't see the freight train coming down the tracks. As we walked out onto the stage, the applause felt hollow. I could see Emily's face on the giant screen. She looked exhausted, terrified, and guarded. Sarah, on the other hand, looked like she was ready for a coronation. She waved to the audience, sat down, and adjusted her binder. I sat down across from her, took a breath, and looked her right in the eye. I didn't start with the history. I didn't start with the binder. I started with the reality of the moment. I looked at the audience for a second, then back at Sarah, and I said, Sarah, you brought a lot of paper with you today. You've got dates, you've got times, you've got transcripts of phone calls that happened 5 years ago. But I want to ask you something before we even look at that binder. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be a mother? Because you can't be both right now. She blinked, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. She started to open the binder, her fingers trembling slightly, and she said, Dr. Phil, if you just see the evidence of how they've treated me, I stopped her right there. I told her that I didn't care about the evidence of her grievances. I told her that a relationship isn't a court of law where the person with the most documentation wins a trophy. I told her that she was winning the war, but she was losing her family, and that's a pretty hollow victory. I turned my attention to the screen where Emily was watching us. She looked like she wanted to crawl out of her skin. Her face was pale, and she was biting her lip so hard I thought it might bleed. I asked Emily to tell me what it was like growing up in that house, and for the first time in years, Emily spoke directly to her mother, though she did it through the safety of the camera. She didn't talk about the dates or the binder. She talked about the feeling of being invisible unless she was doing exactly what Sarah wanted. She talked about the quiet game, where Sarah wouldn't speak to her for a week if she didn't get an A on a test. She talked about the time she was 6 years old and spilled milk on the rug, and Sarah made her sit in the corner for 4 hours because accidents are just a lack of discipline. While Emily was pouring her heart out, I was watching Sarah. She wasn't listening. She was literally flipping through her binder, looking for a rebuttal. She was looking for a page that proved the milk incident didn't happen exactly that way, or a page that showed she had bought Emily a nice dress 3 weeks later to make up for it. She was litigating the past instead of hearing the pain of the present. I leaned in close to her and said, Sarah, look at your daughter. Look at her face. She is crying, she is hurting, and you are looking for a receipt. What is wrong with this picture? Sarah looked up, her eyes hard, and she said, she's lying, Dr. Phil. She's being coached by Mark. He's the one who turned her into this stranger. That's when I knew we had to go deeper into the why. You see, Sarah wasn't just being difficult. She was operating from a place of profound, unhealed trauma of her own, which she had weaponized against her children. I started to dismantle the narrative she'd built. I asked her about her own mother. Sarah's face changed then. The hardness didn't go away, but a layer of shadow fell over it. She admitted that her mother was tough, a woman who didn't believe in softness. She described a childhood where she was never hugged, never told she was loved, and only rewarded when she was perfect. I pointed out to her that she had spent 58 years trying to earn a love that was never going to come, and now she was demanding that same perfection from her children as a way to validate her own existence. She was using Emily and David as mirrors to reflect a version of herself that she didn't believe in. You're trying to heal your childhood by controlling theirs, I told her, but you can't go back and fix what happened 30 years ago by breaking your daughter's spirit today. You think if you can just get them to admit you were a good mother, then you'll finally feel like one. But Sarah, a good mother doesn't need a binder to prove it. A good mother is a safe place to land. And right now, you are the storm they are trying to outrun. The tension in the room was suffocating. The audience was dead silent. Emily was sobbing on the screen. Sarah was white-knuckling the arms of her chair. She was at a crossroads. She could either drop the shield and admit she had failed, or she could double down on the delusion. She chose to double down. She started screaming about how ungrateful they were, how she had paid for their colleges, how she had stayed in a loveless marriage for them. She was throwing every sacrifice she'd ever made in their faces like they were weapons. It was a classic guilt trip at 80 miles an hour. I let her go for a minute. I let the audience see the raw, unfiltered anger that her children had been living with for decades. When she finally ran out of breath, I read the statement from David. I read it slowly, making sure every word landed. David wrote about how he loved his mother, but he loved his children more. He wrote about how he couldn't let his kids grow up thinking that love was a transaction or that they had to walk on eggshells to be accepted. He said, "Mom, we aren't taken from you, we left. And we aren't coming back until you find the woman you were before you let the bitterness take over." Sarah went silent. That hit her harder than anything I had said. The idea that her son, her golden boy, had reached a point of no return was a blow she wasn't prepared for. She looked at the binder in her lap, and for the first time, she didn't open it. She just sat there, looking very small in that big chair. I told her, "Sarah, you are standing on a bridge that is on fire. You can either jump into the water and swim toward your family, or you can stay on the bridge and burn with your pride. But the bridge is going down either way. You aren't going to win this. There is no version of this where they come crawling back and apologize for being brainwashed. That's a fantasy you're using to keep from looking in the mirror." I decided to try a different tactic. I asked her to close her eyes and imagine it was 20 years from now. I asked her to imagine she was at the end of her life, lying in a hospital bed. I asked her who was in the room. She didn't answer. I asked her if the binder was there. I asked if the receipts were keeping her warm. A single tear finally escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek. It was the first sign of real, uncalculated emotion I had seen from her all day. "I'm so alone," she whispered. It was so quiet the microphones barely caught it. "Yes, you are," I said, not to be cruel, but to be honest. "And you've worked very hard to be this alone. You have pushed away everyone who ever tried to love you because you were too afraid they would see that you didn't feel worthy of it. So you replace love with control. But control is a lonely God, Sarah. It doesn't give anything back. It just takes and takes until there's nothing left but a blue binder and a lot of empty rooms." I turned back to Emily. I asked her if there was anything her mother could say right now that would make her consider opening the door just an inch. Emily looked at her mother through the screen, her eyes searching for something, anything that looked like the mom she used to wish for. Emily said, "I don't need an apology for the past, Mom. I just need you to stop attacking my present. I need you to see me as a person, not a project. If you can do that, maybe we can talk in a few months. But the binder has to go, the lies about Mark have to stop, and you have to go to therapy not to fix us, but to fix yourself." Sarah looked at the screen, then at me. She was trembling. This was the moment of truth. This was the breakthrough we look for. But breakthroughs aren't always pretty, and they aren't always permanent. Sometimes they are just a crack in the armor. Sarah looked down at the binder. Her hand hovered over the cover. For a second, I thought she was going to throw it on the floor. I thought she was going to reach out to the screen and tell her daughter she was sorry. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's hand hovered over that blue binder for what felt like an eternity. The studio lights were humming, the audience was leaning forward, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head. This was the precipice. This was that split second where a person decides whether they're going to step into the light of the truth or retreat back into the comfortable darkness of their own delusions. I watched her knuckles turn white. She wasn't just holding a binder, she was holding on to her identity. If she let go of those papers, she'd have to let go of the idea that she was the hero of this story. She'd have to face the fact that she wasn't a victim of parental alienation, but a perpetrator of emotional exhaustion. And for a woman like Sarah, who had built her entire sense of self on being the perfect, wronged mother, that kind of honesty felt like death. She didn't throw it. Instead, she pulled the binder closer to her chest, cradling it like a child. She looked up at me, and the vulnerability I'd seen a moment before was gone and replaced by a cold, familiar spark of defiance. "I can't just throw away the truth, Dr. Phil," she said, her voice regaining its sharp schoolteacher edge. "If I admit that I'm the problem, then everything they've done to me, the way they've shut me out, the way they've kept my grandchildren from me, it all becomes okay. And it's not okay. It's not right. A mother is supposed to be respected. The Bible says, honor thy father and thy mother. It doesn't say honor them only if they're perfect." I leaned back in my chair and sighed. It's the oldest play in the book using a scriptural or moral high ground to justify toxic behavior. I looked at her and said, "Sarah, you're real big on the honor thy mother part, but you're real short on the father's. Provoke not your children to wrath part. You're using your role as a mother as a license to be a tyrant. You think that because you gave them life, you own the life they live. But that's not how it works. You don't get respect because of a title. You get respect because of how you treat people. And right now, you're treating your daughter like an adversary in a deposition." I turned back to the screen. Emily's face had gone from hopeful to heartbroken in a matter of seconds. She had seen that look on her mother's face 1,000 times before the look of a woman who would rather be right and alone than wrong in love. Emily shook her head, a stray tear falling onto her cheek. "See, Dr. Phil," Emily said, her voice trembling, "it's always the binder. It's always the evidence. She doesn't even see me. She just sees a case she needs to win. Mom, I'm right here. I'm your daughter. I'm not a line item in your grievance list. I'm a human being who is telling you that you're hurting me. Why isn't that enough for you to stop?" Sarah started to interrupt, but I held up a hand. "Let her finish, Sarah. You've had the floor for 58 years. Give her 5 minutes." Emily took a shaky breath. "Every time I try to tell you how I feel, you tell me why my feelings are wrong. Every time I try to set a boundary, you call it alienation. You told the whole town that Mark was hitting me. You know that's not true, Mom. You know he's a good man. But you said it because you couldn't stand that he was the one I went to for comfort instead of you. You tried to destroy my marriage because you couldn't control it. Do you have a page in your binder for that? Do you have a tab for the lies you told the police when you called for those wellness checks?" Sarah's face flushed a deep, angry red. "I was worried about you, Emily. You weren't answering your phone. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to wait," I cut in, my voice dropping into that low, serious register that lets people know I'm done playing games. "You were supposed to respect the fact that she's a grown woman with a husband and a life. But you didn't, did you? You used the police as your personal delivery service to force her to acknowledge you. That's not worry, Sarah. That's a power play. That's you saying, if you won't talk to me voluntarily, I'll make the guys with guns and badges knock on your door. How do you think that made her feel? Do you think that made her feel loved? Or do you think it made her feel hunted?" Sarah went silent again, but it wasn't the silence of reflection. It was the silence of a cornered animal looking for an exit. This is where the psychological heavy lifting happens. I had to get under the anger, under the pride, and get to the core of the dysfunction. I asked Sarah, "What are you so afraid of?" If you put that binder down and you admit that you've been overbearing and you admit that you've been controlling, what happens to you? Who are you then? She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine terror in her eyes. "I'm nothing," she whispered. "If I'm not the mother who did everything right, then I'm just a woman who failed at the only thing that ever mattered to her. I've sacrificed everything for them. My marriage, my career, my youth. If it was all for nothing, if they don't love me after all that, then what was the point of any of it?" There it was, the sunk cost fallacy of parenting. She had invested so much of her identity into being the martyr mother that she couldn't afford to see her children as independent adults. If they were independent, then she was obsolete. If they were happy without her, then her sacrifices didn't have the value she'd assigned to them. She was clinging to the conflict because the conflict was the only thing that still connected her to them. To Sarah, an angry relationship was better than no relationship at all. She was picketing their lives just to stay on the property. Sarah, I said, leaning in, you've got to stop looking at your children as an extension of yourself. They aren't trophies you put on a shelf to show what a good job you did. They are people, and right now, they are people who are exhausted by you. You say you sacrificed everything for them, but did they ask you to, or did you do it so you could hold it over their heads for the rest of their lives? Because a gift with a price tag isn't a gift, it's a loan. And you're here today trying to collect the interest. I turned the conversation toward the one question I'd been saving. This is the one that usually strips away the noise. I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said. Forget the binder, forget Mark. Forget the alienation and the neighbors and the town gossip. I want you to look at that screen at your daughter. Look at her. Now, here is the question. If you had to choose right now between being right, keeping your binder, keeping your pride, and keeping your story that you're the victim or never seeing your grandchildren again for as long as you live, which one are you choosing today with your behavior? The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the rafters. Sarah looked at the screen. She looked at Emily, who was waiting, breathless, for the answer. Sarah's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. She was struggling. Her ego was screaming at her to defend herself, to bring up that one email from 2017 to mention the time Emily forgot her birthday. But the weight of the question was too heavy to ignore. I want to see my grandkids, she finally said, her voice cracking. Then why are you doing everything in your power to make sure that never happens, I ask. Because every time you open that binder, you're slamming the door on those kids. Every time you badmouth Mark, you're telling Emily that her judgment is garbage and her life is a mistake. Is that what a perfect mother does? Does she make her daughter choose between her husband and her mother? Because I promise you, Sarah, she's going to choose her husband and her kids every single day of the week and twice on Sunday, and she should. That's what a healthy woman does. I saw a crack, just a small one. Sarah's grip on the binder loosened just an inch. I decided to push a little harder on the reality of her situation. I told her about the long-term effects of this kind of high-conflict parenting. I told her that if she didn't change, she was going to be the grandmother who died as a stranger. I told her that her grandkids wouldn't remember her high standards or her discipline. They would only remember that their mom got a panic attack every time the phone rang. You're creating a legacy of fear, Sarah, I said. Is that what you want? When those kids grow up, do you want them to talk about you the way you talk about your own mother? With that cold, hard distance? Because you are becoming the very person you said you'd never be. You're repeating the cycle and you're calling it love. But love doesn't require a dossier. Love doesn't require a wellness check. Love is a choice you make to put someone else's peace above your own need to be right. Sarah looked down at the blue binder. She ran her hand over the plastic cover. She looked like she was seeing it for the first time, not as a shield, but as a weight. I don't know how to stop, she admitted, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a defense. It sounded like a plea. I don't know how to just let it go. If I don't have this, I don't have anything. You have a daughter who is still on that screen, I reminded her. She hasn't hung up yet. She's still listening. That's a miracle, Sarah. After everything you've put her through, she is still sitting there waiting for you to be the mother she needs. Don't you think it's time you stop making her wait? I looked at that blue binder sitting on her lap like it was some kind of holy relic, and I knew we had reached the point where the rubber meets the road. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, getting right into her personal space. Sarah, you just said you don't know how to stop. That's the most honest thing you've said since you sat down in that chair. And the reason you don't know how to stop is because you're addicted to the drama. You're addicted to the feeling of being the wrong party, because as long as you're the victim, you don't have to look at the wreckage you've caused. But I'm going to help you stop right now, today. I reached out my hand toward the binder. I didn't grab it. I just held my hand there waiting. Give it to me, I said, my voice steady and low. Sarah clutched it tighter for a second, her knuckles turning white, her eyes darting to the cameras and then back to me. She looked like I was asking for her right arm. This is my life, doctor. Phil, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is everything I've been through. If I give this to you, what do I have left? You have a chance at a future, I told her. But you can't walk into the future carrying a suitcase full of old grudges. You're like a person trying to swim across a lake while holding onto a bag of lead weights. You're going to drown, Sarah, and you're going to drag your children down with you. Let it go. Give me the binder. It was a standoff. I could see the internal war playing out across her face. On one side was 58 years of habit, of control, of using evidence to shield herself from the truth. On the other side was the small, quiet voice of a mother who actually missed her kids. The audience was dead silent. Even Emily on the screen seemed to hold her breath. Finally, with a shaky, jagged exhale, Sarah's fingers uncurled. She slowly, reluctantly slid the thick blue binder across the space between us and into my hands. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. I took it, felt the weight of all those years of resentment, and I didn't even open it. I didn't need to. I knew what was in there. The same old songs, the same old he said, she said, the same old justifications for why she was right and everyone else was wrong. I stood up, walked over to the side of the stage, and handed it to one of my producers. Take this backstage and put it in a shredder, I said. Sarah let out a small, choked gasp, but she didn't move to stop me. I sat back down and looked at her. She looked naked, without it. She looked exposed. Now, I said, for the first time in 3 years, there is nothing between you and your daughter. No binder, no legal threats, no wellness checks, just you and Emily. What do you want to say to her? And Sarah, if you start a sentence with, I only did it because, or I'm sorry, but I'm going to stop you. I want a real, raw, human apology. No excuses, no buts, just the truth. Sarah looked up at the screen. She looked at Emily, who was watching her with an expression that was a mix of hope and sheer terror. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. She started to say something about Mark, caught herself, and then went quiet again. The struggle was real. She had spent so long speaking the language of conflict that she had forgotten how to speak the language of love. Emily, Sarah finally said, her voice small and fragile, I didn't know I was hurting you that much. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was protecting you. She paused, and I saw the old habits trying to claw their way back in. I gave her a look that said, don't go there. She swallowed hard and continued, but I see now, I see that I've made you afraid of me, and that is the last thing I ever wanted. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for making you feel like you had to run away from me just to breathe. On the screen, Emily collapsed. She put her head in her hands and just sobbed. It wasn't a cry of anger, it was a cry of relief. It was the sound of a wall finally beginning to crumble. I just wanted to be enough for you, Mom, Emily choked out through her tears. I just wanted you to be happy for me. I love Mark, and I love my kids, and I just wanted you to be part of that without trying to run it. I've missed you so much, but I couldn't keep letting you break me. I know, Sarah whispered, and for the first time, she looked like she actually did know. I know. But an apology is just a beginning. It's not the finish line. I had to make sure Sarah understood that this wasn't a quick fix that would get her a ticket to see the grandkids by next Tuesday. I looked at Emily and asked, Emily, what does the road back look like for you? Because we're not just going to flip a switch and act like the last 3 years didn't happen. What do you need from your mother moving forward? Emily wiped her eyes and looked directly at her mother. I need you to stay in therapy, Mom. Not just for a week or two, but for real. I need you to work with Dr. Phil's team. I need you to learn how to be a person who doesn't need to control everything. And I need space. I can't do Sunday dinners yet. I can't do phone calls every day. I need us to start with 1 email a week. No talk about the past. No talk about the alienation. Just tell me about your day, and I'll tell you about mine. And if you can do that, if you can respect my boundaries without fighting me on them, then maybe in a few months we can talk about a video call with the kids. Sarah nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't mention the binder. She didn't try to negotiate for more time. She just accepted it. I can do that, she said. I turned back to Sarah. This is going to be the hardest work you've ever done, I told her, because you're going to have to learn how to live without your armor. You're going to have to learn how to sit with your own discomfort instead of projecting it onto your children. You're going to feel lonely, and you're going to feel the urge to pick up that phone and start a fight just to feel connected. But when that happens, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember how it felt to see your daughter's face when you finally told the truth. That's the feeling you're working for. Not the win, but the connection. I had my team set up a plan for both of them. We arranged for Sarah to see a top-tier psychologist in her area who specialized in high-control personalities and family reconciliation. We also set up support for Emily and Mark because they were going to have to learn how to navigate this new version of Sarah without falling back into their own old patterns of defense and withdrawal. As we started to wrap up the show, the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The heavy, toxic fog that had been hanging over the stage since the beginning had lifted. It wasn't happily ever after. Life doesn't work like that, but it was a start. Sarah stood up, and for the first time, she didn't look like a school teacher ready to hand out failing grades. She looked like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck and was finally standing on dry land. I walked over to her and shook her hand. You did a brave thing today, Sarah, I said. You gave up the one thing you thought was keeping you safe, and you found out it was the very thing that was keeping you alone. Don't go back for that binder. Don't let your mind try to reconstruct it. Leave it in the shredder. She looked at me, her eyes clear for the first time. I think I'm ready to try, Dr. Phil. I watched her walk off the stage, her shoulders a little less rigid, her head held a little differently. I looked at the screen one last time, and Emily gave a small, tentative wave before the feed cut out. It's a long road back from the kind of damage they'd done to each other, and there are no guarantees. But as I've said 1,000 times, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. And today, Sarah finally acknowledged the truth. I sat back in my chair for a moment after the camera stopped, thinking about the thousands of families out there who are currently building their own binders. People who are so busy being right that they've forgotten how to be kind. People who think that love is a list of grievances and that a relationship is a balance sheet. It's a tragedy that plays out in living rooms across the country every single day. But every once in a while, someone is willing to put the binder down, and when they do, they find out that the truth doesn't just expose you, it sets you free. The studio lights eventually went down, and the crew began the familiar dance of clearing the stage, but I stayed in my chair for a few minutes longer than usual. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes after a session like that. It's not a physical tiredness, it's the weight of carrying someone else's reality until they're strong enough to carry it themselves. I watched the empty seat where Sarah had sat for 2 hours, and I thought about the thousands of pages in that blue binder that were now sitting in a bin waiting to be turned into confetti. It's a powerful metaphor, but I've been doing this long enough to know that shredding the paper is the easy part. Shredding the mental patterns that created those pages, that's where the real heavy lifting begins. A few weeks after the show, I got a report from the psychologist we set Sarah up with. The first few sessions were, as I expected, a train wreck. Sarah showed up to the first appointment with a legal pad, ready to correct the record regarding what had happened on my stage. She told the therapist that I had traumatized her and that Emily had played to the cameras. This is what we call an extinction burst. When a person who relies on control suddenly loses their grip, they don't just give up, they double down. They kick and scream and try to set the world on fire one last time to see if the old tactics still work. Sarah was trying to build a new binder, a new shield to protect her ego from the stinging cold of the truth. But the therapist I chose doesn't blink. She sat there and let Sarah vent for 45 minutes, and then she asked one question. Sarah, does this legal pad make you feel less lonely? That stopped her cold. It was the same nerve I'd hit on stage, but now there were no cameras, no audience, and no Dr. Phil to perform for. It was just Sarah and her choices for the next 3 months. They didn't talk about Emily or David. They talked about Sarah's father. They talked about the little girl who was told that if she wasn't the best in her class, she didn't deserve to eat at the big table. They talked about the transactional nature of her upbringing and how she had spent her entire adult life trying to buy love with perfect behavior and then demanding a refund when people didn't perform the way she wanted. While Sarah was doing that work, Emily was doing her own. She called my producers about 2 months in, sounding like a completely different person. She told us that for the first time in her life, she didn't wake up with a pit in her stomach wondering if her mother was going to sue her or call the police. The 1 email a week rule was being strictly enforced. Sarah had tried to slip in a few guilt trips early on, complaining about her failing health or how empty the house was, and Emily, true to her word, simply didn't respond to those parts of the emails. She only responded to the sentences that were healthy. She was training her mother, much like you train a child, to understand that only respectful, boundaried behavior gets a reward. The real test came about 6 months later. It was Sarah's grandson's 5th birthday. In years past, Sarah would have sent a massive, expensive gift with a card that said something like, "Since I'm not allowed to see you, I hope this makes up for the mother you have." It would have been a hand grenade wrapped in birthday paper. But this year, Sarah called her therapist before she did anything. They spent an hour talking about what a healthy grandmother would do. Sarah ended up sending a simple, age-appropriate book and a card that just said, "Happy birthday, I'm thinking of you, love Grandma, no barbs, no hidden messages, no binder folder." Emily told us that when she opened that package, she sat on her kitchen floor and cried. It was the first time in her adult life that her mother had given a gift that didn't have a hook attached to it. That small, simple act did more to bridge the gap than all the screaming and crying on my stage ever could. It was a sign of earned trust, and that's a concept people often misunderstand. Trust isn't something you just give back because someone says, "I'm sorry." Trust is a mountain that you have to climb 1 inch at a time, and you can lose 10 feet of progress with one bad step. Sarah was finally starting to climb. Today, Sarah and Emily have started doing short video calls, 10 minutes, once every 2 weeks. They don't talk about the past. They don't talk about the parental alienation theories. They talk about the weather. They talk about recipes. And Sarah gets to see the top of her grandson's head as he runs past the camera. It's not the perfect relationship Sarah once envisioned in her head, but it's a real one. And a real imperfect relationship is worth more than 1,000 perfect lies. I've spent my life watching the human condition play out in the most public way possible, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the truth is a patient thing. It doesn't mind waiting for you to get tired of lying to yourself. Sarah got tired. She realized that she was a manager with no employees and a mother with no children. She had to hit that rock bottom of absolute isolation before she was willing to put down the binder and pick up the phone. When I look back on this case, I don't think about the drama or the yelling. I think about that blue binder sitting in the shredder. I think about the weight that lifted off that woman's shoulders the moment she stopped trying to be right and started trying to be connected. Family isn't about documentation. It's not about who did what to whom in 2014. It's about the messy, complicated, beautiful choice to stay in the room when things get hard. It's about being a safe place to land instead of a storm to outrun. Sarah still has bad days. She still feels the urge to start a file or keep a record when she feels slighted. But now she has the tools to recognize that for what it is, a fear-based response to a world she can't control. She's learning that you don't have to be in control to be loved. In fact, it's usually the opposite. The more you try to control, the less love you'll actually find. I'm proud of her, and I'm proud of Emily for having the courage to set the boundaries that saved her family. It's a long road, but they're on it together. And at the end of the day, that's all any of us can really ask for. I'm Dr. Phil, and I'll see you next time.